everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, Operations Specialist at Redmond Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redmond is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to responding to urban natives, children, youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review by email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at hanovi@red-wind.net. That's HONOVI @red-wind.net. As this states, this project is supported by grant number 15JOVW21GK02258 TRIB, which is awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Presenting with us today are Christopher Krebs, Tara Richards, Emily Wright, and Sheena Gilbert. Dr. Christopher Krebs is a principal scientist in the Division of Applied Justice Research at RTI International, which is a nonprofit research organization committed to conducting research that improves the human condition. He conducts research in several different areas, including corrections, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, criminal justice systems, and program evaluation. Dr. Krebs has been at RTI since 2000, and he has been conducting climate surveys on victimization in colleges for 17 years. Dr. Tara Richards is an assistant professor at the School of Criminal Justice and Criminology at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Her research focuses on the intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and the role of gender in criminal violence or criminal justice system processes. Richards has extensive experience in both qualitative and quantitative research and has received funding from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, National Institute of Justice, and the Office of Violence Against Women. She is currently serving as a consultant on an Office of Violence Against Women funded project to increase victim service capacity at tribal colleges and universities. Dr. Emily Wright is a professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and the associate director of the Nebraska Center for Justice Research at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She is also a member of the Cherokee Nation. Her research focuses on violence against women and children, particularly those in marginalized populations. She has received funding from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the National Institute of Justice. She is currently serving as a consultant as well on the Office of Violence Against Women funded project to increase victim service capacity at tribal colleges and university. And finally, we have Sheena Gilbert, who is a PhD student at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. She is also a member of the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe. She has published in academic journals such as Feminist Criminology and Race and Justice. Her research focuses on victimization in underserved populations, as well as Native American crime and victimization and policy reform, as well as campus sexual victimization. So this event has captioning, which you will need to turn on manually. And if you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box, the Q&A, or click the hand icon. And I will now turn it over to our wonderful presenters.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to queue up my presentation real quick. We want to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start off with a relatively fast-paced, more general presentation on the importance of doing campus climate surveys on victimization. And then my colleagues will follow and speak with more specifics about things to think about, potentially when doing climate surveys at tribal colleges and universities. So that's some of my bio and my background, but I think you already heard about that from Hinovi. What we'll be trying to convey in this initial presentation are some of the main reasons that climate surveys on victimization that has been experienced by college students are so important. And here, when we're talking about victimization, we're specifically speaking about sexual harassment, sexual assault, dating violence, and intimate partner violence and stalking. So one of the main reasons that we think climate surveys done at individual universities is so important is because national data on the prevalence of various forms of victimization cannot be used to infer a given school's rates. And another way of saying that is whatever happens at another school or whatever happens in some big study says nothing about what's happening at an individual school, and certainly nothing about what's happening at an individual TCU. So we've seen research done in the past that has really confirmed this. We've been doing climate surveys for schools for a long time, and there was a renewed attention to the issue in 2014, and we did a lot of work at that time as part of the task force to protect students from sexual assault, and we'll be talking about some of that research. But it's really about driving home this message that until a school is able to conduct a good climate survey about victimization, it's really hard to understand the magnitude or nature of the problem experienced by their students, faculty, or staff. So you've seen studies perhaps where there's talk about a national estimate, 1 in 5 undergraduate women will be sexually assaulted while they're in college or something like that. But the reality is that doesn't tell us anything about what's happening at an individual school. Here's an article written about that statistic. I will admit that that statistic comes from a journal article that we published in 2007, but we never used that statistic in the journal article because our data were only from 2 universities at that time, and neither of them were TCUs. So of course, we didn't intend that to be used as a national estimate, but that's sort of how it got used. And a gentleman at the Washington Post decided to dig into that statistic and figure out if it was accurate, which we never claimed it to be. I will say that a lot of other researchers have come behind us, and we've replicated that work. And oftentimes the rate does seem to be around 1 in 5 or sometimes 1 in 4, but no national estimate exists. And even if one did, it wouldn't be useful for individual schools. Recent studies have confirmed this, including the one that we conducted and completed in 2016. We did the Campus Climate Survey Validation Study. It was funded by the Office on Violence Against Women and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And we surveyed students at 9 colleges and universities. Again, none of them were TCUs. We surveyed a total of 23,000 students across those 9 schools. We had pretty good response rates for a variety of reasons. We had about 54% of undergraduate women respond to the survey and about 40% of undergraduate men. Those respondents look very similar to the non-respondents, but we did do some minor weighting adjustments to increase the representativeness of the results in the data. Published our final report. And one of the things we were able to show, and I'm going to show you in the next slide, is how much variation there is from one school to the next. So even though these schools, they varied geographically, some were public, some were private, some were small, medium, or large, but they also had plenty of things in common, yet their victimization rates experienced by their students varied a lot. So this next slide is going to have a lot of colors and numbers and things going on, but I'll walk you through it so I can try to convey the variation across schools. So in our results, we use sort of sexual assault to convey an overall concept in which someone has experienced unwanted sexual contact that they did not consent to and that they did not want to happen. And then within sexual assault, a victim or a survivor can experience either rape or sexual battery. We convey those as mutually exclusive concepts. So if the sexual assault involved penetration, we say they experienced a completed rape. If it did not involve penetration, we consider that they experienced completed sexual battery. So on the far right is the average prevalence rate for undergraduate women during the 2014-2015 academic year averaged across the 9 schools. And the red dot says that 10% of undergraduate women across these 9 schools experienced a completed sexual assault during the academic year. And then about 6% experienced sexual battery, about 4% experienced a completed rape. But then the numbers across the bottom are just random numbers assigned to the 9 schools to represent each school. And then you can see how much there is variation across the schools. The little bars on either side of the red dots convey the confidence intervals. So it's how accurate or how precise the prevalence estimate is. So school 1 on the far right, 20% of undergraduate women experience a completed sexual assault during the academic year. About 13% had experienced sexual battery. About 6% had experienced rape. On the far left, you see school number 2, about 4% experienced sexual battery, much lower prevalence rates. And then there's everything in between. And then the makeup even of whether someone experienced rape or sexual battery can vary dramatically from school to school. So school 1 has a lot more sexual battery than it does rape, whereas school number 5 has almost as high a prevalence rate for sexual assault, and then the rape and sexual battery rates are actually comparable. Again, these data tell us that until a school has data about the experiences of their students, there's no way for them to truly measure and understand the population. And then, of course, in addition to prevalence estimates, we can collect information, a lot more information about incidents and what happens to students, so we can understand their experiences and try to prevent sexual assault, improve our responses to them, and get them services they need. The other reason we need survey data is because schools can't rely on official reports or statistics to understand the magnitude or nature of the problem. So as you all probably know, sexual assault is the most underreported crime in the world. And most sexual assaults are never reported to any official source. So official data or arrest reports or anything like that can be very misleading. Here's some data from the Campus Climate Survey Validation Study, where we see that for rape incidents and sexual battery incidents, which we represent here with blue bars and green bars, about 2/3 of survivors tell someone close to them, tell friends, tell family members, roommates. And that's maybe good news because maybe those people can help them get services and the help they need. But the vast majority of incidents never get reported to law enforcement or any school officials. On the far right, we've just combined any school official with any law enforcement official to try to get a total reporting to official sources. And even for incidents that involve penetration and rape, 12.5% of incidents actually get reported to authorities. So Clery Act is something that a lot of schools have to report to in the United States. Whenever a crime occurs on or immediately adjacent to campus and becomes known to or is reported to an official on campus who's required to report under Clery Act, they're supposed to report those statistics to the federal government. So one thing we decided to do was compare our survey data to what shows up in the Clery Act. So when we looked at the 9 colleges and universities where we did our work, we decided to focus on rape because those are the most serious incidents and we thought they would be most likely to be reported to authorities. We see that at the 9 schools, a total of 40 rapes were reported to the federal government under the Clery Act for 2014. We then decided to look in our survey data once it was weighted up to represent the entire populations at the universities. And we see that within our survey data, we can identify 2,380 completed rapes that happened during the 2014 academic year. Although only 770 of those occurred on campus. In other words, only 770 meet that criteria for having to be reported under Clery Act as opposed to off campus. And only 170 of the 2,380 were reported to authorities who would have been required to report under Clery. And when you look for common rape incidents between the 770 on campus and the 170 that were reported to authorities, you arrive at only 60 rape incidents out of the 2,380 we could identify in our survey data that had been experienced by students at these schools that would have been or should have been reported to the federal government under the Clery Act. So 60 rape incidents occurred on campus and were reported to authorities compared to 40 who were actually reported up under the Clery Act. So at the end of the day, we take this to mean that if you feel good about, if you have a lot of confidence in Clery Act data, but you doubt our survey data, you actually should have more confidence in our survey data, and vice versa. If you don't like Clery Act data, but you like our survey data, maybe you should have confidence in both sources, because statistically speaking, 60 and 40 in this situation aren't any different. So the visual we often use is the tip of the iceberg. This is what universities maybe know about for these 9 schools, these 40 rape cases. In reality, we estimate that 2,380 rapes were experienced by their students during the academic year. The other thing climate surveys can help schools do is decide where and to whom they should direct resources, or what those resources should include. So they can tell us things like which student populations are most at risk for being victimized, when students experience victimization, where it happens, why students do not report their experiences, since we know the majority of survivors don't. So here's some data on sexual assault since entering college experienced by men and women, broken down by different gender identity and sexual orientation categories. So on the far left, you see that for women, all women, the prevalence of experience of completed sexual assault since entering college. Now here we're talking about a longer reference period, not just the academic year. We actually collect data on both periods. About 20% of women experience a completed sexual assault. But if you look at women who identify as bisexual, you see that rate goes up to 35%. It just tells you that certain women may be at accelerated risk for experiencing victimization, and you can use that to potentially inform your service-related or response efforts on campus. Similarly, among men, you can see that men overall as a group, in terms of undergraduate students, experienced sexual assault at about 7% prevalence rate. But gay men experience sexual assault at a much higher rate, closer to 24%. Some of these sample sizes are kind of small, so the gray bars that extend out past the color bars, both up and down, are a little bit wider, and you can see where groups tend to overlap, which means they can't be, when the confidence intervals overlap, those estimates can't be distinguished from one another statistically speaking. But even so, you can see which groups are potentially at accelerated risk. And obviously transgender students are the group that we identify with the highest victimization rates, but again, with a fairly high confidence interval around that estimate. Something else we can look at is when sexual assault incidents occur. So here for women, this is a count of the number of sexual assault incidents experienced by undergraduate women by month for across the 9 schools, because we asked them to place in time or estimate in which month different incidents occurred. And what you can see here is evidence of what many people call the red zone, which is the time period in the fall when many believe the rate of sexual assaults, and there's data to support what they believe, that in the fall is when the most sexual assault incidents occur. And certainly here, many of these schools didn't even start classes and things until late August, sometimes September. But you can see that the number of sexual assault incidents in September, October are the highest throughout the academic year. And that can tell a school, yes, we need to start our programming perhaps over the summer, or our prevention messaging over the summer, or certainly right when students arrive on campus, to try to head off some of this peak that occurs in the fall. We see the same data with males, although because the victimization rates are so much lower, obviously, even though it peaks in October, the number of incidents is much lower as well. We can ask folks about their experience reporting sexual assault when they do, although, as you know, most people don't. But when they don't report their sexual assault to various authorities, we can also ask them why not. And I think this is a difficult thing to do, and sometimes a difficult thing for survivors to conceptualize and report on. But it does give us some information about reasons why they maybe didn't seek help or didn't report. Here we're showing data broken down for women and men separately, but a lot of them these are some of the top reasons that people reported not reporting their sexual assault to authorities. And the reasons for men and women are actually quite consistent. A lot of it has to do with fear of retaliation, thinking that they will be held to blame or be considered at fault. That's especially true when alcohol is involved. So sometimes a survivor was drinking when the victimization occurred, and the victim might think that they're going to get in trouble because they were drinking alcohol if they were underage. That can result in people not reporting, even if a school has an amnesty policy that would forgive that. Some students don't necessarily know about that policy or trust that policy. A lot of victims or survivors indicate that they do not report their victimization because they did not want any action taken. And to people who don't work in the area of sexual victimization, that seems odd to them. But if you all have met with survivors and understand what they're going through and their perspective on what happened to them, we see this a lot with survivors who are ready to move on as best they can, thinking that they can be strong and get through this, and many of them can and do, but a lot of them just don't want to engage the process, maybe because they don't trust the process, maybe because they had friends who have been treated poorly. But for whatever reason, we see a lot of survivors who simply want to try to move on with their lives and not necessarily report anything officially or have any action taken. So these sorts of data can help schools in all sorts of ways. It helps improve awareness, raising efforts, training. It can inform prevention programs in terms of what they need to focus on, justify and know how to allocate resources for survivors, improve outreach, support, and services for survivors, inform the development of new programs. We're hearing a lot about transformative and restorative justice efforts, and information that can be collected in a survey can help schools understand students' willingness to engage with those alternative approaches and what those alternative approaches need to offer in terms of support and services. Can also help schools understand how to modify and improve policies and practices, whether it be about consent, whether it be about amnesty policies, anonymous reporting mechanisms, whatever survivors might need to come forward and potentially seek the services and help and justice that they need and want. And what we always say is that without school-specific survey data, many schools are kind of left flying blind and trying to anticipate what's happening on campus or base their decisions and their policies and practices based on what's happening elsewhere. And we really hope that schools can one day engage in good climate survey research to collect data that they can use to really understand their situation. The other nice thing about climate surveys is if they're repeated periodically, you can measure things over time. So are victimization rates increasing or decreasing? Is the climate or the environment or culture on campus that's related to sexual harassment or sexual assault, is it improving as we do things on campus to try to influence those things in a positive way? When we changed our prevention programming, or if we change how we go about staffing the Women's Center, or make any changes to what we're doing, staff more female officers in the police department, whatever it is, by measuring these things over time, maybe a few years apart, you can start to understand whether you're influencing things in the designed and intended ways. So we can measure change over time, which is often of interest. And then this is really important. We think that doing good climate surveys, and we hear a lot that doing good climate surveys is about being transparent and showing that the school is committed to addressing things that are impacting their students, faculty, and staff. So just conducting the climate survey and showing your students and your faculty and your staff that this is an interest that that's important to you and that you're wanting to address and acknowledge, that builds trust with your community. It can also help improve the culture and create an environment where survivors are more comfortable reporting victimization experiences and maybe seeking services. It can also lead to more bystander or more effective bystander intervention behaviors, which again can lead to prevention and increased health and safety for students, faculty, and staff. So we and others consider climate surveys a best practice and an essential component of victimization prevention and response, but we acknowledge that there's lots of challenges to them. They can be expensive, they can be a burden, and it's always about trade-offs and figuring out what's possible and what priorities kind of win the day. But certainly they're designed to generate much needed school-specific information and data on the prevalence and nature of various forms of victimization. And here's just a quote that we think helps drive this home from a couple senators who have been pretty supportive of climate surveys. And that is from Senators Gillibrand and Ayotte from New Hampshire. The key to understanding sexual assault and then fighting it is going to be in the data. And we tend to agree with that. And the last thing I'll just say is, just doing a climate survey isn't enough. And we see plenty of schools do them in a way where the data maybe aren't necessarily as good as they should be or as representative of the student population as they need to be. So for climate surveys to be useful, it's really important that they be done well. And certainly we can provide some guidance on what that means and how to do it. So I think that's it for me. I think we were going to do questions in between the presentations. So I can stop talking and certainly see if anyone has any questions about anything I had to say.
Once again, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat or you can put them into the Q&A.
I see something in chat. Will this be available? Alberta is asking, meaning the slide deck. Certainly, I think you can tell us, Honovi, but the plan will be to send out the slide deck or provide it?
Yes. Yeah, if there are people who would like to have access to these slides, you can definitely get those. And the presentation itself is recorded, so it will be up on Redwind's YouTube channel within a few days.
Great. I can stop sharing my screen. And certainly I'm not going anywhere. So if you all think of questions for me later, I can always answer them later.
I'm ready whenever you are, Honovi.
All right. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, so we can move on.
Okay. So the second half is, as it was kind of mentioned earlier, is looking more at campus climate surveys specifically for tribal colleges and universities. So it'll be tailored a little bit more to those type of schools, whereas Dr. Krebs was very, with the broad campus climate surveys for like the mainstream universities. You can go to the next slide. So Hanobi did a brief introduction earlier. So as mentioned, the three of us are at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Dr. Wright is a member of the Cherokee Nation, and I am a citizen of the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe. And although Dr. Richards is not Indigenous, she's definitely an ally and does a lot of research involving Indigenous people. And between the three of us, we have combined expertise in gender-based violence among college students, looking at victimization among Native persons, looking at different laws, policies, and responsive relevant to student victimization on college and university campuses. And then previously I haven't been able, this is my first project with Redwind, but they have worked with Redwind before to develop a holistic response to sexual violence at TCUs. And then they've also served as researchers on 2 NIJ-funded tribal research partnerships. Next. So you might ask, why are campus climate assessments important at TCUs? First and foremost, you kind of have to take a look at the broader picture. You need to understand the scope of gender-based violence that happens at TCUs, specifically with this type of population, that being Indigenous people. Overall, they have the higher rates of violence and victimization compared to any other race, ethnicity. To kind of give you some statistics, so in a national study, André Rosay in 2016 looked at data from the 2010 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey and compiled a report looking at violence among both Native men and women, and found that more than 4 in 5 Native men and women have experienced violence in their lifetime. That includes sexual, physical, psychological, and stalking. And then more than 1.5 million Native women and 1.4 million Native men have experienced violence in their lifetime. And then Native women are 1.2 times more likely to experience violence in their lifetime compared to non-Hispanic white-only women. And then Native men are 1.3 times more likely to experience violence in their lifetime compared to non-Hispanic white-only men. So that is like a national study. There have been smaller studies that work with individual tribes, and they basically have similar findings, that there's just a high amount of violence that happens within these communities. And then looking kind of like how that violence and victimization plays over the life course. Dr. Richards and colleagues looked at adverse childhood experiences to see how those impacted violence and victimization later in life. And they found that Native Americans reported the greatest number of what we refer to as ACEs compared to other race ethnicities. They had the highest rate of physical abuse, sexual abuse, parental substance abuse, witnessing violence than any other race ethnicity. And then Native females specifically reported the highest rate of emotional abuse, and Native males reported a higher rate of physical neglect. So that just kind of shows you why these assessments would be very important for tribal college and universities, because when you're working with this population, they just have those high rates of violence and victimization, which can happen any point in time in their life. And we know that sometimes a lot of violence happens during those college age years. Also, violence against women and children, it's not an Indigenous value. A lot of the times when you talk with individuals, they tell you that the violence kind of comes from outside forces. It's something that one research, they said it came from like the outsiders. So it's not necessarily something that was always experienced within tribal communities. It's just over time it has evolved into what I consider an epidemic. And then we look at underreporting might be higher among Native Americans. As Dr. Krebs pointed out, that any kind of gender-based violence is just in general underreported, but with this population, it might be even more because you need to consider the history of these people. And, you know, there's just a failure to investigate. If the federal government has to get involved, the failure to prosecute. So then that's going to lead to kind of lack of trust in different kinds of services and different agencies. Sometimes there could just be, like, it doesn't jive necessarily with their cultural values, with being, you know, a spiritual population. It just, the reporting and then the process going through the criminal justice system just might not coincide with those traditions and beliefs. Next. So again, continuing why our, you know, CCA is important. Again, looking at this historical trauma in Indigenous communities, a lot of it dates back to the inception of the country, where you have the theft of their land, being forced removal from their communities, and then being relocated, whether to reservation land or within urban environments. The assimilation to the Western society and the Western ways, and then ultimately the genocide, just the large amount of killing of Native individuals way back, like I said, from the inception of the country. And then with that, there's just been an extreme loss of their traditions, culture, beliefs, language, people, which then leads to this this lack of trust of outsiders. Again, this goes back to like the idea of colonization, when when Columbus came over and just tried to force a lot of those Western ways onto Indigenous people, forced that patriarchy, which then broke down gender roles, which then left women specifically more vulnerable to violence. When you go look at that assimilation that came with colonization, you think of the boarding schools, where children were removed from homes and placed into boarding schools to learn to be more quote unquote American, more white, I guess, in a sense. So you have to consider all that historical trauma of Indigenous people and like why this violence and victimization still exists in the capacity that it does today. And then lastly, like Native students, the faculty and staff, especially if the faculty and staff are also Native, they're more likely to experience gender-based violence. And then when you have the impact of this, the immediate trauma, and then you have to think about that historical trauma, there sometimes it becomes very hard to separate those two types of trauma, because they could be very overlapping, they can be very long lasting, they can just be very debilitating and everything. So you have to, like I said, you always have to consider that history and the trauma that comes with that. We have to talk about the historical trauma, then you have the intergenerational trauma, and then that historical oppression that all plays a part when a person gets victimized and having to go through that process. Next. And then again, talking about all that victimization, how when we're looking specifically at students, how it can be very detrimental. For somebody that experiences sexual assault or stalking, it can affect the retention, they're wanting to stay in the university. It could become too overwhelming and they have to drop out. It can impact their academic success. There was one study that looked at Native students that had experienced violence and had found that they had lower grade point averages compared to those who hadn't experienced any kind of violence or victimization. So you have to remember, as these individuals are being victimized, it is then impacting their education. And then we just have to remember too that just overall there's just a lack of representation of Natives in mainstream higher education. So, you know, we want to encourage these students to go to school and seek education, but then we also have to like think about, you know, if they get victimized, how it could be even more detrimental for them versus a non-Native student. So then with these campus climate surveys, as Dr. Krebs mentioned, they can help kind of identify what kind of resources. So these prevention and intervention services are very critical at these tribal colleges and universities, just because, you know, they could be that anchor institute in the community where the students come together, even like community members come together. So if you have more focus on this prevention and intervention, that can help with that retention and that academic success, and it can help build a stronger community. They can also help identify where services are needed. You know, you could, if you find like an area that needs it the most, then you can create these programs that can kind of focus those resources where things are most needed. And then lastly, with these surveys, you can get the perspective of students, faculty, and staff, and to identify like who is at risk, what to do about it. It's just a great way to kind of bring the community together, and then you can have that community perspective on just looking at better ways to protect these Native students while they're getting an education. And then I'll hand it over to Dr. Wright.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I do think that it's important to really consider what Dr. Krebs was talking about in terms of findings across many mainstream college campuses, and even how the campus assessments are conducted at those institutions, and think about how we might tweak that, change it, to apply these to tribal colleges and universities, because TCUs are different in many ways than mainstream college campuses. So remember, the mission of TCUs is in many ways just to be the pillar for preserving the traditional ways of the tribe. Many of the cultural centers might be in a vital part of the TCU. And I think it's important that we don't just simply apply what we've done in mainstream campuses with regard to campus climate work and just apply it to TCUs. I do believe that there are ways that we can tweak these and get the communities more involved, really sort of start from the ground up perhaps before or when we do the campus climate. Now, why do we want to be careful of that, right? Well, we don't want to do any harm to erode the mission of the TCU, right? We do not want to undermine that very important right to self-determination among Native people as well. And again, we need to consider the ways that TCUs are different than mainstream college campuses, so that approaching TCUs with campus climate assessments would be more sensitive, right, and more appropriate. Can you go to the next slide, please? So how are TCUs different from mainstream campuses? In many, many ways, they are different. I would say the first and foremost is the mission of TCUs. TCUs, their cultural, protecting, preserving, and teaching cultural values is really at the forefront of tribal colleges and universities in terms of their mission. And within that, we need to remember that violence against women, gender-based violence, is not an Indigenous value. So this would be a core piece of that mission that is usually taught at TCUs. I think another thing that's quite different across between TCUs and mainstream campuses is there student populations, as well as the settings where they physically exist. So many of the TCUs are more rural, which actually plays a big part in terms of victim services that are available to those who report being victimized, responses as well, not just and I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a slide or two, but not just the availability of resources, but also how long does it take to get responders, right? And to get hooked up with the services that you need. So the setting is really important, and that differentiates the resources that TCUs might have versus mainstream campuses. And then responses to the act of being victimized, right? Or reporting victimization. So for instance, at TCUs, you would want to preserve the traditional values and practices that are typically more restorative, like Dr. Krebs talked about. They're more restorative. In this case, a lot of them will involve the inclusion of elders as well, in terms of the tribe's responses to victimization, not only the victim, but also potentially the offender in some ways. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the levels of resources. They are vastly, unfortunately, different between TCUs and mainstream campuses. So the different levels of resources will impact many other subsequent issues, right? Whether that's does the college, does the university have existing policies and procedures that dictate how they will respond to gender-based violence? Does the Title IX coordinator have to do multiple things? Do they wear many hats, so to speak? Or, which usually happens at a more limited sort of resource campus, or are they just dedicated to Title IX issues, which we see a little bit more of in the mainstream campuses, which have, again, higher levels of resources. Additionally, confidentiality becomes an issue. So again, your levels of resources across the different types of campuses will sort of dictate a little bit of these issues. So for instance, confidential resources. If you have a small campus, a small population, and you don't have a dedicated, let's say, Title IX coordinator, or the Title IX coordinator has to do a lot of different things, you do start to worry about whether or not issues can be kept confidential. The other thing is that you have highly integrated and close-knit people, whether it's faculty, staff, or students, that often come from the tribe. Again, resources can be thought of in terms of, do you have access to victim survivor services at the campus, or do you need to drive or travel for long distances to get the student who's been victimized into the correct services? And again, your levels of resources are going to impact some of these issues. And then instead of just thinking about the students, which they are very, very important, but we also have to think about resources for faculty and staff, because they are often the ones who get the initial report anyways. And sometimes they don't know what to do either. So again, the levels of resources between TCUs and mainstream campuses can and may impact each of these sub-bullet points when it comes to responding to gender-based violence. Next slide. And then I think we have to remember cultural values as well, right? So when you're dealing with TCUs, again, they're going to be sort of a microcosm of the nation or of the tribe that they are affiliated with. And you will see different cultural values around what actually constitutes trauma and victimization. What does that mean? So one of the things that we've talked about in our group over time has been things like, well, you know, were the elders, did they experience boarding schools, right? This could be, you know, a unique trauma, a unique victimization that this tribe has experienced, and that might change in some way or another the way that the community feels about what actually is trauma and victimization. So this falls along cultural values. I think Sheena talked a little bit about how historical trauma and things like this might impact Native groups, how willing they are to disclose whether they've been victimized or whether they know somebody who's been victimized. And it might also impact the response to victimization. So, for instance, if you as a Native person have experienced victimization, but you've had experience with law enforcement or other social service agencies that's been negative, right? They haven't been helpful. This might impact whether you're willing to report again or seek out their services again. And then again, this goes back to cultural issues. When you respond to trauma or respond to victims, a more culturally centered or a more culturally oriented response when it comes to Native communities should be more holistic. It should be more oriented around reintegration with the family and the community. In other words, it needs to be grounded in the specific cultural values of that tribe that the TCU is in. And then finally, I would say jurisdictional complications do make things a little bit different when it comes to dealing with gender-based victimization at TCUs versus mainstream campuses. And there are some jurisdictional issues over here as well. But when we talk about tribal colleges and universities, we hear over and over and over again, just in Indian country, their law enforcement responses can be more difficult because you have different jurisdictions operating around the reservation. So you might have non-tribal jurisdiction or law enforcement. You might have law enforcement, tribal law enforcement on the reservation land. And sometimes this can make folks confused as to who they should report to, who they should go to for help, and when they should do so. So some of these things will complicate the response to gender-based violence when it comes specifically to tribal colleges and universities. And I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Richards now, if you want to go to the next slide, Hinobi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright and Sheena and Dr. Krebs for all that fantastic background information. So I think the most fun part, which is really kind of talking about how we can apply all these things to see TCUs. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about a project that we're starting right now with one of our amazing attendees. Hi, Alberta. We are so glad you're here. So, you know, I think it's really important when we talk about tribal colleges and universities is to think not just about the areas of challenges, but also all of the strengths, right? Because we know Indigenous people, tribes, tribal nations are incredibly resilient. And one of the, the mission and the values that are central to TCUs is such a strength that mainstream universities don't have. when we have had the great fortune of visiting some TCUs, it's just always amazing to me to walk around campus and see all of the signage that, that declares the TCU's values and mission for the students, faculty, and staff, all of the campus stakeholders. And so a great place to sort of start thinking about doing a campus climate assessment is for the campus stakeholders to think about what are the strengths that we have as a TCU and as a community. And that can help you then identify where are the places where we really need partnerships, right? So these are our strengths. These are the things that we are really able to do as a TCU or as a community. And then here are some of the areas where we really need to seek outside partnerships. And that could be, from the tribal coalition, from just outside other, tribal organizations like victim service providers, like Red Wind, right? Your tribal TA folks, or it could be, outside research partners. It could also be other TCUs, right? So really thinking about where do we have strengths? Where do our strengths lie? Where do we need to set up partnerships? And, one of the things that Dr. Wright and I have really tried to think about and consider when we're working with tribal colleges and universities and other, in our tribal researcher partnerships that we're doing with, tribal entities broadly, is think about how can we leverage the federal dollars that the National Institute of Justice and the Office on Violence Against Women devote specifically to tribal researcher partnerships, right? Which, that allows TCUs and other tribal entities to add research capacity, right? To add sort of expertise and bodies, even because we understand that everybody is sort of overworked and overextended. But it also, for researchers like us, it allows us to fund fantastic PhD students like Sheena Gilbert here, who is an Indigenous woman who will become the next generation of victimologists and criminologists doing this work. So, thinking about these researcher, tribal researcher partnerships, it allows us not only to expand capacity for the TCU, but also really provide these invaluable educational experiences to, students. And you guys are educators and administrators. And I know that that's always at the forefront of your mind, is like, how can we support our students? Novi, can you flip the slide, please? So when we are really thinking about campus climate assessments and how, these partnerships might work, we always want to make sure that the TCU staff, faculty, students, stakeholders, community, right, that they are really at the forefront of developing these assessments. So Dr. Krebs, Dr. Wright, Sheena all talked about the importance of thinking about tailoring what we know about campus climate assessments, to TCUs, not just sort of picking it up and putting it down at TCUs and just saying like, this is going to work the same, right? Because there's really not a roadmap. And we've, my colleagues here have done such a great job of talking about all of the differences and the ways in which TCUs are unique. So we need to be thinking about a unique model for TCUs. And I would go even farther than that and purport that it might even be that every TCU's assessment is going to look a little bit different because of some of the unique factors around, community size, rurality. We know tribal nations are not a monolith, right? I mean, every tribe has unique customs, cultures, values that are going to need to be integrated into an assessment like this. So some of the other things that, a TCU might need to think about is really in their community, what is the meaning of violence and victimization, right? What are the types, what are potentially some of the experiences that your community is experiencing that maybe is not something that is, is at the forefront of a mainstream campus, like for example, missing persons, right? So thinking about, how to ask questions about missingness, about, the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children in your community. That might be a type of victimization that needs to be included in a TCU's campus climate assessment that isn't something that a mainstream campus would ever even consider. Also thinking about, providing assessments in English and in the native language, right? Especially if we want to really be inclusive of elders and, again, really bring those cultural education to bear, right? We understand that TCUs, one of the important responsibilities that you hold is making sure that that language is preserved, right? And then, as Dr. Wright talked about a little bit, really considering confidentiality, right? We understand that that can be really difficult on a TCU campus. Sometimes there's not confidential sources for support and reporting, and sometimes even when there is confidential, reporting and support sources, because the community is so small, news gets out, and really, how can we protect that student and their family, that victim, and then also the alleged perpetrator, right? Because one of the things that sort of the broader Title IX landscape, and that I'm sure all of you think about as administrators at TCUs, is how do we attempt to serve victims, complainants, while also, wherever possible, keeping the respondent connected in terms of their education, right? Educational equity, and really, thinking about the role of restorative justice, and is there a way to bring this person back into the community while keeping, the community safe, and, keeping that victim survivor safe, and hopefully trying to make them whole again. All right, Hanovi, can you flip the slide for me, please? So, we know that this is going to be a smaller scale, right? We're not going to be doing a survey instrument with hundreds or thousands of students, right? And given that, it may not even be a survey, right? We need to think about, how best to really collect this information. How is this information going to be most useful to this community? And it may look very different than the traditional campus climate assessment. So we also need to make sure that, and this is a we, this is really a researcher we, right? That, as we're thinking about collaborating with TCUs, as TCUs are thinking about collaborating with researchers, someone who is really committed to this work knows that the research should be for the community, should be for the TCU and not of it, right? That the TCU really should be sort of driving the collaboration, and that those partners should in fact be partners, right? And should not be there really to dictate what the instrument looks like, or what questions should be asked, or how the TCU should do something, but instead should really be an equal partner, making suggestions and bringing best practices to the table, so that the TCU can consider lots of options and think about what's going to work best for their community. And then, sort of as I started my section, assessments should be thinking about considering and asking questions, not just about risk factors or challenges or victimization experiences, but also should be considering strengths, right? So what do students, faculty and staff who are responding to this assessment, where do they see the strengths of their community, of their TCU? And that information can really be helpful, as Dr. Krebs said, that the university can leverage that information to track progress, right? To hopefully make positive impacts on the experiences of students, when it comes to, an increase in victim services, a decrease in victimization experiences, et cetera, over time. Okay, flip the slide, please. So finally, one of the additional differences is probably going to also be in how results are reported out. So it may not be most useful to sort of have a traditional final report that goes up on a website, but instead, the reporting out might be more of a community meeting, right? It might be, for the campus community first, and then the larger nation community, as a whole. The reporting out might include sort of traditional practices, prayers by elders, stories, reflections on the sort of present or current experiences that are outlined in the findings of the assessment, and a reflection on prior experiences of the tribe over time. And then there's probably going to be an integration of those traditional practices in considering what to do with those results, right? What changes need to be made, what services or responses need to be available to students once you have that information, right? Because this whole process really is about gathering information for your TCU and your community, so that you can then act on that information to improve the safety and the security and the well-being of your students, faculty, and staff. Okay, go ahead and flip the slide, please. So I'll end, my piece by just outlining very briefly a new project that Dr. Wright is heading, and Dr. Gilbert. She's almost Dr. Gilbert. Yeah. Sheena and I are supporting, and it is a tribal researcher partnership between this UNO team and then Tohono O'odham Community College, or TOCC. It's an NIJ funded project where we, in fact, are attempting to collaborate with TOCC to develop a strengths and needs assessment for that campus, and help them design a campus climate assessment for their community, for their TCU. So just to outline sort of the major objectives, so you can see concretely how this might work, right? So TOCC is first and foremost going to establish what we're calling a gender-based violence advisory board. And it's really, the university is going to identify the key stakeholders on campus that need to be at the table, right? Now, of course, everybody in the campus community is a stakeholder, but we know there are some key folks, right, that need to be at the table, and they need a leader, and that's going to be Alberta, who is the Director of Counseling Services. And once this advisory board is developed, then we, as the research partners, can really collaborate with this advisory board to get a good understanding of the strengths and needs of TOCC in regard to their training, their policies, their procedures, their victim services, really understanding, again, where do they have the support that they need, and then where would external partnerships be helpful for them. Based on that information, we can help facilitate those new partnerships, help develop MOUs. If there's not resources sort of in the community or, in the sort of local Tucson area, really trying to connect them to national resources. We didn't make the connection between TOCC and Redwind, but Redwind's a great example, right? So thinking about, hey, if there's not, if the expertise that we need is not here locally, is there a national tribal TA provider that could help bring those resources to bear? And then finally, we want to help TOCC develop a culturally centered campus climate assessment, right? So that we really can, gather that information on stakeholders' experiences, knowledge, and access to resources regarding gender-based violence. But in this project, we are really collaborating with TOCC to get to the point where they have that campus climate assessment in hand. And then they will be in charge, they will be empowered to deploy that assessment and gather the data. And we'll be, standing by to help them organize that data and analyze that data. But that is not, we're not there to do the assessment for them, right? Or gather that data. We understand, that the self-determination and the rights of the tribe, and the fact that they own that data. So we're being very cautious about our role as research partners, and then the community's roles and community experts role in terms of sort of accessing that data, owning that data, analyzing that data. And then also, of course, we as researchers, and, I think this is a good place to close and get have questions. We also know that, being sovereign nations, research like this, collaborations like this often have to go through many formal, both informal and formal processes within the tribe, right? Hopefully culminating in that tribal resolution that says, yes, the tribe wants this partnership. They understand, what this collaboration is going to mean. And they kind of put their seal of approval on it. So, that is a challenge, that can be a challenge. And so we, are very fortunate that over many years, we've developed that relationship with TOCC and the, Tohono O'odham Nation to be able to do a project like that or like this. So we, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that, we understand that these relationships aren't built in a day. And so giving you this level of information, you might be thinking about, how could I do this on my campus? And, we want to offer, sort of our support, and we're here to answer questions and help you sort of think about those things, because we understand it's easier said than done to build these collaborations. So I think that's a great place to stop, and we're happy to take questions.
I'll give everyone a few more seconds to ask any questions before we start wrapping up. All right, well, thank you, everyone. So before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and it will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel within the next few days. And that's also where you can find our previous recordings. So in closing, I'd like to thank our presenters. I'd like to thank our captioner, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.